You were 12 when the men came. They smiled as they dismounted, smelling of horse sweat, iron, and imported wine. You remember the way their shadows spilled across the courtyard, long and heavy like nets, and how your mother pressed a coin into your palm and whispered, "Stay inside." But you didn't. You stepped into the sun. You were beautiful, and that was your mistake. Before we plunge deeper, take a moment to ground yourself. This story may feel far away, but the echoes are closer than they seem. If you're listening from Seoul or Sao Paulo, Nairobi, or Naples, let us know in the comments. It's staggering to realize that across centuries and continents, we're uncovering these forgotten lives together. If this story moves you, remember to like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling the truths that history tried to erase. He was not the first. Somewhere between the cracked fields and the crumbling altars of rural Greece, a quiet economy thrived in shadows. Boys with wide eyes and even wider shoulders, prized not for their wit or strength, but for symmetry, cheekbones, skin tone, hair that curled just enough at the neck. Villages, starving from drought or drained by war, learned quickly that beauty was their last exportable good. The merchant came with scrolls. His ledger was already half filled. He walked with an arrogance that only silver can afford. When he spoke, it was in the measured Greek of the coastal cities, not the raw dialect of the hills. A short term of service, he told the father. He will live well, learn music, perhaps, be useful to a household. Of standing, the father said nothing. He stared at the floor. The mother made the sign of the gods, then turned away. The boy didn't understand, not yet. Across the Greek world, from the Theban foothills to the backstreets of Corinth, this transaction repeated itself endlessly, and it was no secret. In fact, it was a practice that coexisted comfortably alongside the values we are taught to revere: democracy, philosophy, rhetoric. Plato wrote of love between men and boys as something sacred, a path to wisdom. But what was sacred about a child being sold to a man 3 times his age under the guise of mentorship? In Athens, they called it paiderastia, a structure so deeply woven into society that questioning it would be like questioning the Parthenon's columns. On the surface, it was a bond between an Erastes, the older lover, and an Eromenus, the younger beloved. But in practice, it was often a system ripe for abuse. The law claimed to protect freeborn boys. There were penalties for seduction, for example, but the poor, the rural, the enslaved, they weren't protected by anything but luck, and luck rarely came. One surviving fragment from an unnamed poet in Boeotia reads, "He was taken in spring when the apricots bloomed. No one noticed save the goats." It sounds poetic until you realize it is a child's abduction rendered as art. That same child likely ended up in the household of a landowner, trained in music, dance, recitation, not for education, for entertainment. In wealthier homes, these boys were washed in scented oils, taught how to laugh softly, how to sit gracefully at the feet of their masters during symposia, those opulent drinking parties that later philosophers would romanticize. Picture it, bronze goblets ringing with wine, poetry echoing off marble, and in the corner the boy, quiet, smiling when spoken to, punished when not. But not all boys stayed quiet. In 411 BCE, the comic playwright Aristophanes staged Thesmophoriazi, a satire targeting powerful men and their hypocrisies. Among the jokes and absurdities lies a single, sharp line: he trades in boys, but lectures on virtue. The audience laughed, nervously perhaps, because they knew it was true. By the time most boys understood what had happened to them, it was too late. If they resisted, they were punished. If they obeyed, they were used. Either way, their names vanished. These boys didn't write books or carve their likenesses in stone. History preserved only their outlines, anonymous figures in pottery scenes, eyes lowered, flanked by men in expensive robes. And yet, for a brief moment, a few names flicker in the dark. Like Klinos, mentioned in a scandalous court case in Athens around 370 BCE, he had once been a servant in a wealthy household, later testifying in court against his former master. The charges were dismissed, of course. The boy's words meant nothing. But in the transcript, buried in bureaucratic language, a phrase leaps out. He wept when asked to recount it. That was enough for the scribe to include, nothing more. It's easy to fall in love with the myth of Greece, the columns, the sculpture, the clarity of light across white stone. But every civilization has its currency, and in the hidden economies of the ancient world, beauty was as profitable as grain, and sometimes far more dangerous. Somewhere out there, the merchant's scroll is still being written: different names, different currencies, same transaction. Because in the end, the boy was right. His mother told him to stay inside. But beauty, once seen, cannot be unseen. There was no door to your room, only a curtain thin enough to let through the laughter, thick enough to trap the smell of wine and sweat. You learned to sleep lightly, to wake before the footsteps stopped outside your threshold. You were never taught to read, but you learned to listen closely, perfectly to every shift in tone, every slurred command, every silence that came before the pain. If this story resonates with you, let us know where you're watching from. Whether you're in Manila or Manchester, Cape Town or Caracas, the fact that we are rediscovering these silenced lives together is nothing short of extraordinary. Your support keeps this history alive, so like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Together, we bring the shadows into the light. To the world outside, the villa was a sanctuary of refinement. Its columns gleamed under the Attic sun, its servants moved in practiced harmony, and the master, an Athenian aristocrat with influence in the assembly, was known for hosting the most elegant symposiums in the city. To be invited was to be seen was to be powerful. But beneath that elegance, hidden behind mosaic-tiled halls and perfumed courtyards, existed a smaller world, one of narrow quarters, barred windows, and whisper-thin commands. A world where boys taken young, trained quickly, were molded into instruments of pleasure. Not slaves in the traditional sense, not equals, certainly, something in between, something less stable, more dangerous. Each evening, as the villa prepared for its guests, the boys were made ready, not just washed, prepared, fingernails scrubbed. Raw, hair oiled and curled, skin scented with imported myrrh. They were drilled in the gestures of grace, how to bow without appearing servile, how to pour wine with downcast eyes, how to smile as though unaware of the silence that always followed them. One of the oldest surviving symposium cups shows a youth balancing a lyre in one hand and a wine jug in the other. The man across from him is laughing, but if you look closely, the boy's face is without expression, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the rim of the cup. These boys were not ornaments, they were performances. In the structure of the symposium, they played multiple roles. They served wine and recited verses. They played the double flute hollows or danced in carefully rehearsed routines meant to blur the line between art and allure. But most importantly, they remained accessible. A touch, a whispered invitation, a lingering glance from a guest could mean the night would not end in their own bed. And always, always, there were the rules. Not for the guests, for them. Do not look a guest in the eyes. One trainer is rumored to have said, they may see themselves reflected and hate what they find. These villas often employed an older servant, usually a eunuch or former concubine, who managed the younger boys. This figure was both jailer and teacher. In one fragment of comedic dialogue attributed to Eupolis, a boy mocks such a man. He speaks of moderation with a belt in hand. The audience would have laughed, but the truth beneath the line was clear, yet not all boys stayed quiet. One court record from the 5th century BC describes a scandal involving a politician named Antidoros. The charge? Hosting indecent entertainments involving underage boys. The trial was brief. The boy whose name is lost was never called to testify, but the court scribes noted a detail. The boy had run away, not fled, not escaped, run away, a child's phrase in an adult record. Where did he go? Perhaps to the Piraeus, the port where anonymity flowed like cheap wine. Perhaps to the temples, where priests sometimes took in the broken. Perhaps he was caught and returned. There is no record of what became of him, but his absence made enough noise to reach the courts. The most chilling aspect of this entire system was its silence. There were no formal ledgers of concubines, no scrolls labeled with their names and ages. They existed in the margins. Occasionally they appeared in jokes, or in the background of painted pottery, or as fleeting metaphors in plays. In Lysistrata, Aristophanes mentions a youth so fair that even the old men wept when he walked past. It was meant as comedy, but the weeping perhaps was more telling than the beauty. What does it say about a civilization that prized balance, reason, and democracy yet allowed this system to persist unchecked? How can a culture produce both Socrates and silence? And still the villas remain. Not the structures themselves, most have turned to dust, but their ghosts linger in the literature, the broken statues, the anonymous fragments of song. And in those spaces you can almost hear the music begin again. The lyre, the laughter, the whisper of bare feet on marble, and behind it all, the boy trained to never speak first, to never ask for help, and above all, to never be seen in the daylight, because in houses with no shadows, the darkness lives in plain view. He stands there still cold, flawless, eternal, bronze skin catching sunlight. Like a living god, you reach out, wanting to touch, but your fingers pass through the centuries. He does not move, he cannot speak, and yet, somewhere behind that perfect face, someone once wept. If you're hearing this from Or Budapest, Jakarta, or Johannesburg, take a moment to drop your city in the comments. There's something profound about tracing ancient footsteps while scattered across the modern world, united by curiosity, by memory, by a refusal to forget. And if these stories resonate, consider liking and subscribing. With each voice that joins us, we reclaim another silence. The Kuros statues, those proud, youthful male forms carved in the archaic period, were meant to embody ideal beauty, vigor, and balance. Standing nude, their arms stiff at their sides, they bore the blank, serene smiles of beings untouched by suffering. But whose beauty were they modeled after? Whose features did the sculptors study, memorizing the curve of a lip, the slant of a cheekbone, the arch of a collarbone? They were not drawing from myth alone, they were sculpting from life, from boys, in gymnasia and palaces, in the sunlit courtyards of Athens and Delphi. The bodies of young men, especially adolescents, were placed on display under the guise of education, aesthetics, and moral elevation. Nudity in the Greek world was not necessarily erotic, it was considered noble, a sign of purity, of openness. But this reverence came with consequences. Plato, in his Symposium, describes love between an older man and a younger boy as a pathway to virtual ladder, he calls it, ascending from physical attraction to spiritual truth. But what happens when that first rung is rooted in exploitation? When admiration becomes ownership? When the boy never ascends, only the man? This paradox was not lost on all. Xenophon, a contemporary of Plato, took a more cautious tone. In his version of the Symposium, Socrates questions whether physical desire can ever truly be separate from power. But even he stopped short of condemning the practice outright. It was too embedded, too normalized, too useful. And so the boys became symbols, their real lives erased, their suffering dressed in metaphors. In vase paintings, they appear as eromenoi, the beloved, often standing beside older men, receiving gifts: a hare, a rooster, a wreath. But look again, look closer. The boy is always smaller, always looking away, always held lightly at the wrist or the chin, like a statue being inspected. One inscription found near a collapsed villa in Boeotia reads simply, "To Lysias for his beauty and his silence." It is carved into the base of a statue now missing. The dedication was unsigned. Perhaps the artist dared not say, or perhaps he didn't think it mattered. The society that prized reason and rhetoric had little space. For those with no voice, laws did exist on paper. The graph Moechias could be invoked if a freeborn boy was seduced or violated, but trials were rare and convictions rarer still. Most families would rather hide the shame than challenge a powerful patron, and so silence reigned. In the fragmented works of the poet Theognis, there are verses that feel like confessions hidden inside. Praise, he is young, and I love him, though he wounds me. He does not speak, yet I am silenced. Is this love? Is this loss? Or is it guilt dressed in lyric? Even the gods reflected this doublethink. Apollo, the shining patron of music and prophecy, was often portrayed as enamored with youthful male companions: Hyacinthus, Cyparissus, both beautiful, both doomed, one slain by a discus, the other turned into a tree from grief. The myths do not hide the cost, they poeticize it. Art remembers beauty, but it forgets the cost. The chisel doesn't record the bruises. The painter's brush erases the tremble of a hand. The poet's line bends the truth into something palatable, and yet traces remain in the court records where names are blacked out. In the broken pottery showing boys fleeing older men, in the satirical plays where aristocrats are mocked not for their crimes, but for being too obvious about them, in one of Aristophanes' lesser-known fragments, a character quips, "Even the statues are ashamed, that's why their eyes are hollow." It's a joke, a throwaway line, but it lands heavier than intended, because maybe the statues are ashamed. We walk through museums now, marveling at their symmetry, their power, their timelessness. But how often do we ask who paid for that eternity with their silence? History did not forget them. It chose not to remember, and so we are left with fragments: a line in a court transcript, a smudged figure on clay, a name carved into stone with no face to match. But if you listen closely, the silence begins to speak, and what it says is not easily unlearned. He stands in bronze, noble, chiseled, immortal. But beauty has always been a mask, and behind it a boy still waits to be seen.